There's a certain kind of silence that only a woman running for her life knows how to carry. It is not the silence of peace, not the silence of a quiet morning or a still lake or a sleeping house. It is the silence of a person who has learned, through blood, through loss, through the particular education that only grief and danger can teach. That sound is the enemy. That a footstep too loud, a voice too warm, a laugh that escapes before you can catch it back, can end everything. Martha Ellison had been carrying that silence for 61 days when the Apache man found her. Or maybe she found him. That part depends on who you ask, and there's no one left who was there to answer. What we know is this: a widow, a desert, a man who should have kept writing and didn't, and a story that the people who lived it never told while they were alive, because some stories are too dangerous to speak, and some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, and sometimes the only way a thing survives is by being buried so deep that it takes 50 years and a cardboard box in a dead woman's attic to bring it back into the light. This is that story. It is not comfortable. It is not clean. It will not resolve the way stories are supposed to resolve, with justice arriving on a white horse, and the right people saved and the wrong people punished. But it is real. Every word of it. And it begins on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1952, on a stretch of Arizona road so empty that God himself seemed to have looked away, with a woman in a dead man's coat, a horse with a split shoe, and 3 words whispered into the dark to a stranger she had no reason to trust. "Don't let them find me." Asterisk, she said it like a prayer, like she had already said it 1,000 times to the sky and the dirt and the wind and gotten nothing back, and was trying one last time with a human being in case humans were better at listening than the world had been. He listened. This is what happened next. The horse went lame on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Martha Ellison would have found funny once. She had been a woman who found things funny. That was before the funeral in the rain, before the lawyers with their careful faces, before the night 2 men came to the house and knocked the way men knock when they are not asking permission. 3 heavy thuds, like a fist that already owns the door. She had been running since October. It was now the first week of December, and the Arizona desert did not care about any of that. The horse, a brown quarter horse she had taken from her own stable, the one her husband Thomas had bought her the spring before he died, the one he had named Penny because Thomas was the kind of man who named horses after small things, stumbled on a rock the size of a man's fist, and Martha felt it go wrong before she heard it. A shudder through the whole animal, a compensation in the gait, a reluctant listing to the right. She pulled up and climbed down and looked at the left front shoe and said a word she had not said out loud since she was 17 years old, and dropped a cast iron pan on her foot in her mother's kitchen. The shoe had split along the nail line. Riding on it would ruin the hoof. Maybe the horse. She was 44 miles from the town she had been heading toward, and she had $11 and a bag that weighed about as much as regret. She stood on the road and looked north and looked south and looked at the horse. The horse looked back at her in the way horses do, with those big, wet, philosophically unconcerned eyes, as if to say, "I did my part. I got us this far. The rest is your problem." Martha Ellison had grown up in Tucson, the daughter of a hardware store owner who believed that women should know how to do things. Fixe au leaky pipe. Change a tire. Read a contract before you sign it. Her father had said that last part with the emphasis of a man who knew what happened when you didn't, and she had carried that advice through 39 years and 1 marriage, and had still not managed to read the contracts carefully enough because Thomas's business partner had turned out to be the kind of man that no amount of careful reading can prepare you for. His name was Gerald Fitch. She did not let herself think it too long. Gerald Fitch had a way of expanding in her mind when she let him in, of filling all the available space, of becoming the entire room instead of just the problem in the corner. So she thought at once, Gerald Fitch, and then she put in the box where she kept the things she could not afford to feel yet, and she pulled Penny's reins and started walking north. The desert in December had its own particular cruelty. Not the cruelty of summer, which was honest and direct and came for you with the full conviction of something that wanted you dead. The December desert was more subtle about it. The days were cold in the mornings, edging toward warm in the afternoons, dropping back into a cold that bit at your ears and fingers by sunset. The light was thin and clear and made everything look closer than it was. Mountains that appeared to be an hour's walk away were 4 hours or 6, or would kill you if you trusted them. She trusted nothing. That was the one lesson 61 days on the run had driven through her like a nail. The road was the old highway, the one the new road had replaced 4 years back, which was why she was on it. New roads at truck stops and telephone booths and people who noticed you. The old road had nothing. 50 miles of Arizona scrub and silence and the occasional rusted marker that the state had not bothered to remove. She walked for 2 hours. The sky went from thin blue to the purple gold of late afternoon, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes, and she was thinking about whether she could build a fire without being seen from the road. She had matches. She always had matches now. That was another thing she had learned when she heard the horse. Not Penny, a different horse. Behind her, Martha did not run. Running was the wrong move when you didn't know what was behind you. Running told whoever was behind you exactly where you were and exactly how afraid you were, and fear was information she had stopped giving away for free. She stopped walking. She turned around slowly, the way she had taught herself to turn, like a woman without a reason to be in a hurry. There was a man on a gray horse coming down the road, an easy walk. He was leading a second horse, a young roan, barely broken by the look of it, with a rope tied loosely to his saddle. He was Apache. She could see that clearly as he got closer, and she did something in her chest that was not exactly relief, and not exactly the opposite of it. She knew enough about the Apache people to know that what she knew was mostly what white Arizona had decided she should know, which was to say, almost nothing useful. She knew their land had been taken. She knew the government had decided what they were and where they should be, which was a practice she had new and personal sympathy for. She knew that every frightening story she had grown up with about Apache men was the kind of story that got told by people who needed someone to be afraid of so they could justify what they had done. She stood in the road and waited. He was perhaps 50. Hard to say. His face had the kind of lines that come from weather and not from worry, which is a different kind of aging entirely. He wore a canvas jacket that had been good once and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He had a rifle in a scabbard on the saddle and a bedroll tied behind, and the way he sat on the horse had the particular ease of someone who had been riding since before he could form the memory of learning. He looked at her. He looked at Penny. He looked at the split shoe without her pointing to it, which meant he had an eye for horses. He said nothing. She said nothing. The wind moved between them. Then she said it. She hadn't meant to. She had meant to ask about the nearest town, or whether he had seen anyone on the road behind her, or whether there was water nearby. She had a whole vocabulary of safe questions prepared, a conversational camouflage she had been constructing and refining for 2 months. But what came out was not any of those things. Don't let them find me, asterisk, she said. It came out quiet, the way things come out when they've been held so long that they stop being a choice and become just a fact escaping. She watched his face. She had become very good at reading faces in the last 61 days. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, not suspicion exactly, more the careful assessment of a man who has learned to be precise about what other people's trouble will cost him. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at the road behind her, north and south, the way she had looked at it. Then he said, "Get your horse. There's a canyon 2 miles east. They won't find a fire there." His name was Naldo. She didn't know if it was his full name or a piece of a name or something he told white women on empty roads because the real name was not theirs to have. She didn't ask. She had stopped asking questions she didn't need the answers to. They walked east as the last light drained out of the sky, the old highway disappearing behind them as the desert opened up and swallowed the road whole. And Martha Ellison followed a man she had never met into a dark she could not see the bottom of, because the alternative was waiting for what was behind her to catch up. The canyon was real. She would have doubted that right up until it wasn't. It cut through the scrub like someone had taken a knife to the earth, sudden and deep, red-walled, with a narrow floor that caught heat and held it the way canyons do. There was a shallow pool of water at the northern end, snowmelt from somewhere up in the mountains, and the horses drank from it while Naldo built a fire with the quick efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times and no longer thought about the steps. Martha tied Penny's lead to a root that came out of the canyon wall and sat down on a flat rock and looked at the fire and thought about how she had gotten here. She thought about Thomas. Thomas Ellison had been a good man in most of the ways that matter and a fool in one way that turned out to matter more than all the rest. He had trusted Gerald Fitch. They had been in business together for 12 years. Ellison and Fitch mining copper interests in the southern part of the state, a company that had made both of them comfortable and had made Gerald Fitch rich in ways that only became visible after Thomas was dead. Thomas died in August of a heart attack that the doctor said was natural and that Martha had believed was natural for about 2 weeks, right up until she found the second set of ledgers. She had not gone to the sheriff. The sheriff in their county was a man named Randall who drank with Gerald Fitch every Friday night and had been doing so for 15 years. She had not gone to the federal authorities because the federal authorities moved slow and Gerald moved fast. She had not gone to anyone because the one person she called, her lawyer, a man named Birch she had known since she was 20, called her back 3 days later to say he couldn't help her in a voice so carefully neutral that she understood he had been spoken to. She packed a bag. She took Penny. She took Thomas's coat because it was warm and because she needed something of his clothes to her. And that was the thing she had grabbed in the dark of the closet with her hand shaking, and she had been moving ever since. What she had not told Naldo, what she had told no one, was what was actually in the bag beside her clothes and her $11. What she had taken from the house that mattered more than anything else she owned. The ledgers. Both sets. The real ones and the false ones. The proof in Thomas's own handwriting and Gerald Fitch's of a fraud that went back 8 years and touched people bigger than both of them. People whose names she had seen in newspapers and whose faces she had seen at Thomas's funeral, standing in the rain in their good suits with their careful condolence faces. People who had known and said nothing or worse had helped and called themselves friends. Those ledgers were the reason she was running. Not just to get away from Gerald Fitch. To get somewhere she could hand them to someone who could do something with them. Someone outside the county, outside the state if she had to go that far. Someone who didn't play card with Gerald Fitch on Friday nights. She was thinking about this when Naldo handed her something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it. Cornbread. Still faintly warm. She ate it without saying anything. He ate from the same cloth without saying anything. The fire cracked and shifted. Above the canyon walls, the stars came out in the particular way they come out in the desert. All at once, like they had been waiting behind a curtain, and someone finally pulled it. Then Naldo said, "How many are looking?" She looked at him across the fire. "I don't know exactly. 3 that I've seen. Probably more. They have a description of the horse." "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already figured out. "There's a ranch 40 miles north. Woman named Cecilia Redhorse. She has a barn. She won't ask questions." Martha Ellison looked at him and tried to understand what she was looking at. A stranger on an empty road who had offered her cover and food and a name and a direction, and she had no reason to trust any of it. She had no reason to distrust it either. That was the thing about 61 days on the run. You reached a point where the calculus of trust stopped being about certainty and started being about odds. She was bad at certainty now. She had been bad at it since the morning she found the ledgers and understood that the life she thought she was living had a different life running underneath it the whole time, like a river under ice, cold and dark and entirely invisible until the ice broke. She was getting better at odds. The odds that this man was connected to Gerald Fitch were low. The odds that he had some other motive she hadn't identified were possible, but felt thin. The odds that she would last another week alone, in December, in the Arizona desert, with a horse that needed a farrier and $11 and no plan. Those odds she didn't like at all. "Thank you," she said. It was a small word for what she meant. But she had never been a woman who confused size with accuracy. He nodded once and tended the fire, and the canyon held the warmth around them like a cupped hand, and Martha Ellison slept for the first time in 4 days with both hands wrapped around the bag that held everything she had left worth protecting. She dreamed of Thomas. Not the Thomas at the end, the one in the hospital bed with the tubes and the stillness. The earlier Thomas, the one who had named a horse Penny and meant it as a joke and also meant it as tenderness and could not always tell the difference between those two things, which was maybe his best quality, and the thing she missed most, that easy confusion of humor and love. She woke before dawn to the sound of Naldo moving, and she lay still with her eyes open and listened to the particular sounds of the desert waking. The birds she couldn't name, the wind pulling itself up from the canyon floor, the horses shifting and breathing, and she thought, "I am still here. I know what they did to you. I know it wasn't your heart." That last thought she put back in the box very quickly. Not yet. She couldn't afford that yet. She stood up, and her knees made a sound like a comet, and she pulled Thomas's coat tighter against the morning cold, and She looked at Naldo finishing his bedroll and said, "How far to this Cecilia's ranch before the road?" He looked at the sky. He was calculating the way people calculate who have learned to read time from light. "For hours if we move." She picked up Penny's lead. She looked once at the dying coals of the fire. "Then, let's move," she said. She had $11 and a split horseshoe and a bag full of evidence that could burn Gerald Fitch and several men above him all the way to the ground. If she could get it to the right hands, if she could stay ahead of the men looking for her long enough, if the odds she was calculating in the cold desert morning held. A lot of ifs. She had learned to live inside the ifs. There was nothing else to live inside. They left the canyon as the sun began to color the east edge of the sky, and the desert opened up around them enormous and indifferent, and Martha Ellison walked into it with the particular posture of a woman who has decided that fear is not the same thing as defeat. The road that Gerald Fitch's men had taken ended at the highway. The road she was taking went somewhere else entirely. She just didn't know where yet. Cecilia Redhorse was a small woman who wore her authority the way some people wear a good coat. So naturally, so long worn in that you stopped seeing the coat and just saw the person, and the person was clearly someone you did not cross. She was standing in the yard of a ranch that had no business being there when Martha and Naldo came up from the East Trail, standing with a tin cup of coffee in one hand, and the expression of someone who had been told by a bird or a rock or the quality of the morning air that company was coming. Not surprised. Not particularly pleased. Just ready. She looked at Martha. She looked at the horse and the split shoe. She looked at Naldo. She said, "Put the horses in the back barn. The front one is visible from the road." That was all. Martha had been preparing something to say the whole 4-hour walk. Some story, some explanation, some architecture of half-truths built to be believed. She let it go. Cecilia Redhorse was not a woman who needed your story. She already had all the story she needed from the way you stood and the thing in your eyes and whether you treated your horse right. Martha got the impression she had passed some test administered entirely without her knowledge. The back barn was old and solid and smelled of hay and horses and the particular dusty warmth of a building that had been well used for decades. There was a forge set up in the corner, a small one, portable, the kind a traveling farrier might use, and Naldo looked at it and looked at Martha, and she nodded, and he got to work on Penny's shoe while Martha sat on a hay bale and unwrapped her hand from the bag she had been carrying like a second heartbeat. She sat with it in her lap and looked at it. Inside, the ledgers, the real set and the false set. A letter she had written to no one in particular that laid out everything she knew in the plainest language she could manage. Because Thomas had always said that plainness was the most underrated quality in a document, that the ones that held up in court were the ones that a 12-year-old could follow. She had tried to write it the way Thomas would have written it. She had cried while writing it, and then gone back and taken out the crying and made it plain. Also inside, a photograph of Thomas. Not from the funeral, from before. From the spring he bought Penny, standing in the stable doorway with the afternoon light behind him, and that face he had when he thought no one was watching. That unguarded face that was the real one underneath the competent business face he wore in the world. She put her hand on the bag. She took it away again. Cecilia came into the barn with more coffee and a plate with 2 pieces of bread and a small jar of preserves that turned out to be cactus fruit, which Martha had never eaten, which was so sweet it was almost violet. She sat down across from Martha on an upturned bucket and wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at her in the direct, unhurried way that Martha was beginning to understand was just how Cecilia Redhorse looked at things. "How long have you been out here?" Cecilia asked. 62 days. Cecilia nodded. Not sympathy exactly. More like recognition. "You're from the city. Tucson. What did you take?" Martha looked at her. "Why do you ask it that way?" "Because women like you don't run," Cecilia said. It was not unkind. It was just precise. Women like you stay and fight, or women like you go to lawyers. If you're out here in the desert in December with a bag you won't put down, you took something. And what you took is the reason they're still looking. Martha Ellison was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Proof. My husband's business partner killed him. Made it look like his heart gave out. The proof is in here." She touched the bag. 2 sets of ledgers. 8 years of fraud that goes up higher than just Gerald Fitch. Cecilia drank her coffee. "How high?" she said. "Senator's office. Maybe the senator himself. I'm not certain of that part." A very long pause. "My husband," Martha said, and then she stopped, because the sentence had too many places it could go, and none of them were directions she could travel right now, not in a barn in December, not, and keep functioning. He was a good man, she said, and left it at that, and Cecilia did not push on it, which was the right thing to do, and Martha was grateful for it in a way she couldn't have articulated. Naldo finished with the shoe as the morning edged toward noon. He stood up and looked at his work and looked at the horse and patted her neck once, and the horse made a sound that Martha chose to interpret as approval. He came and sat beside Martha on the hay bale without talking and ate one of the pieces of bread. The three of them sat in the barn in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised Martha. She had become accustomed to silence as a survival tool, a held breath, something you maintained out of necessity. This was different. This was the silence of people who did not need to fill the space to justify their presence in it. After a while, Naldo said, "There are two men in Palmero, asking about a woman on a brown horse." Martha felt her stomach go tight. "When?" "Yesterday. Cecilia's nephew came through the town." She looked at Cecilia. Cecilia was looking at the barn door. "Palmero is 30 miles south," Cecilia said. "If they're moving north, they'll reach the highway junction by tomorrow morning. They'll take the old road because the new road has too many people." A pause. "The old road passes this ranch." Martha was already thinking. She could feel the old anxiety spidering up her spine, the one that had lived there for 62 days, but she had learned to think inside it. Anxiety was just information. Information could be managed. "I need to go north," she said. "There's a federal courthouse in Prescott. If I can get the ledgers to Prescott is 110 miles, Naldo said. "I know how far Prescott is." A silence. He said nothing. She understood he was not disagreeing with her, just noting the fact. "I can't stay here," she said to Cecilia. "I won't bring this down on your house." Cecilia looked at her with that unhurried look. "You don't get to make that decision," she said. "This is my house. I decide what comes down on it." A pause. "You'll stay tonight. You'll leave before light tomorrow with better supplies than you have. Naldo knows a way north that doesn't touch the old road for 30 miles. Martha opened her mouth. Cecilia raised one hand, not aggressively, just conclusively. "Don't thank me. It's not charity. If what you're carrying is what you say it is, and it reaches the right people, then it's not nothing. Gerald Fitch and men like him have been a weight on a lot of shoulders for a long time. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because sometimes the right package gets to you, and you either help it along or you don't, and I've never been much good at the second option." Martha Ellison looked at this small, certain woman and felt something crack open in her chest that she had been keeping very carefully sealed. She pressed her lips together hard. "Thank you," she said anyway. Cecilia made a sound that was not agreement and not dismissal, and was probably the most Cecilia Redhorse was going to concede, and she went back to the house. That afternoon was strange and ordinary at the same time, the way days can be when you are in the middle of something impossible, and the world keeps insisting on also being Tuesday. Cecilia fed them a lunch that was real food, actual real food, meat and vegetables and something baked, and Martha ate it like a woman who had forgotten what it was supposed to feel like to eat, because you were hungry instead of because you had to. Naldo tended to his horses. Martha went through her bag and took inventory of what she had and what she needed and what she could leave behind to make room. She looked at Thomas's photograph for a long time. She did not leave it behind. She had been thinking since the canyon the night before about Naldo, about who he was and where he was going and why he was still here instead of taking his two horses and his bedroll north toward whatever destination he had been heading toward when he came across a woman with a split horseshoe on an empty road. She did not ask him directly. That felt like the wrong instrument. Instead, she sat near him while he worked on the roan's saddle, something in the stitching of the cinch that was coming loose, and said, "Where were you going?" "Before." He kept working. "North." "Where north?" "Flagstaff." "Do you have family there?" A pause that was not evasion, just consideration. "My sister. She had a child in October." "I haven't seen him." Martha absorbed this. A man go to meet his first nephew, or second, or whatever the count was. Diverted by a woman and a lame horse on an empty road. She thought about the size of that diversion and what it said about him, and found she did not have the vocabulary for what it said. "I'm sorry," she said, "for pulling you sideways from that." He looked up from the cinch. The afternoon light came through the barn door slant and caught the lines in his face, that whether or not worry kind of aging. "You didn't pull me." I stopped. She looked at him. "Why?" He considered this for a moment the way he considered most things. Not quickly, not slowly, but exactly as long as it deserved. Because you were a person in trouble on a road where people don't stop, he said. And I was a person who could stop. She thought about that. She thought about all the people who had not stopped. Her lawyer Birch, with his carefully neutral voice. The friends who had gone quiet after the funeral. The neighbor who had seen the men come to her house at night and close her curtains. She thought about how many different ways there were to be a person who does not stop. I'll pay you back, she said. When this is done. It doesn't work that way, he said, not unkindly. How does it work then? He thought about it. You find someone on a road, he said. Later. You stop. She understood him. She thought it was probably the most important thing anyone had said to her in 2 months, and that its simplicity was not the opposite of its truth, but was, in fact, the source of it. That night, Cecilia spread blankets on the floor near the kitchen stove, and Martha lay down and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle and thought about Prescott, about the federal courthouse there, about a man named Howard Daniels whose name she had gotten from a letter in Thomas's desk, a letter she had read 3 times before taking with her. A federal attorney, someone Thomas had been quietly, carefully, without anyone knowing, beginning to reach out to in the last weeks of his life. Thomas had known something was wrong. He had been starting to pull thread. Gerald Fitch had made sure he didn't get to finish. She was going to finish it for him. She did not let herself feel the weight of that. If she felt the full weight of it, she would not be able to move under it, and she needed to move. She had become very good at moving under things too heavy to actually bear, which was perhaps the only useful skill grief had given her. Outside, the December wind came down off the mountains and hit the ranch walls and kept going north toward Prescott like it was doing her work ahead of her. She did not sleep well. She slept enough. Before light, that time of the morning that is not yet morning, that thin gray hour when the world has decided to wake up but hasn't gotten around to being visible yet, she was up and packed and standing in the yard with Penny while Naldo saddled the gray horse. And Cecilia came out of the house with a cloth bag that turned out to hold enough food for 4 days, and a blanket that smelled of cedar, and a folded paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map. Martha looked at the map. It showed a route north that used no marked roads for the first 30 miles, that wound through a canyon system she did not know by name, that connected eventually to a ranch trail that connected eventually to a secondary road that would get her to Prescott without passing through any town large enough to have men in it who might be asking questions about a woman on a brown horse. The map was drawn in the precise, confident lines of a woman who had made this particular journey before and knew every turn of it. Martha looked at Cecilia. Cecilia looked back. When I was 26, Cecilia said without preamble, I had something that needed to get somewhere safe. Different something. Same problem. A pause. A woman gave me a map. Martha understood she was not going to hear the rest of that story. Not tonight. Possibly not ever. It lived in the same space as Thomas's photograph, in the category of things too large to carry in daylight. She folded the map and put it in Thomas's coat pocket. There's a name on the back of the map, Cecilia said. In Prescott. She'll put you up until you can reach your federal attorney. Tell her Cecilia sent you. Martha nodded. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto Penny, who stood steady as a table under her, the new shoe solid against the cold ground. Naldo was already moving north, the roan trailing behind him on the rope. She took one last look at the ranch, at Cecilia standing in the yard in the pre-dawn gray with her cup of coffee, and her expression like a woman who has done the thing that needed doing and is already thinking about the next thing. I'll finish it, Martha said. Cecilia made that sound again. Not agreement, not dismissal, not anything you could put a name to. Martha turned Penny north. The desert was dark and enormous and cold and perfectly, completely, utterly silent. She rode into it. The photograph of Thomas was in the bag, which was on her back, which was straight and did not curve into anything that could be called defeat. Not today, not on this road. Not while there was still north to go, and the ledgers were still in her hands, and Howard Daniels was still somewhere in Prescott waiting for a letter that was never going to arrive, but was going to be delivered in person by a widow in a dead man's coat who had been running for 63 days and had not stopped running yet. Behind her, the ranch disappeared into the dark. Ahead of her, somewhere past the cold and the canyon system she didn't know and the 30 miles of unmapped trail, Prescott waited. She did not let herself think about whether she would make it. That question was not useful. The only useful thing was the next mile. She rode the next mile. They found the first man's tracks on the second day. Naldo saw them first. He had the kind of seeing that Martha was beginning to understand was not a skill, but a habit, a continuous, low-level reading of the world around him that never fully turned off, that processed the ground and the air and the behavior of birds the way other people processed words on a page. Automatic, constant, old. He did not say anything dramatic about the tracks. He just stopped his horse and looked at the ground for a long moment, and then looked at the sky, and then said, "We need to go east 2 miles before we go north again." Martha looked at the ground. She could see nothing meaningful. Just dirt, just rock, just the ordinary surface of a world that kept all its information underneath. How many? 1 horse. Fresh. Within the hour. She felt the old cold move through her. Not panic. Not anymore. Just information she had to work with. Ahead of us or behind. He looked at the tracks again. Coming from the east. Heading northwest. A pause. He may not be connected, but the direction is wrong for a rancher. She did her math. A man moving northwest from the east, in this particular stretch of empty terrain, on a December morning when no rancher had business out here. The odds were bad. Gerald Fitch was smarter than she sometimes let herself believe, and smart men didn't just chase from behind. They triangulated. "They're trying to get ahead of me," she said. Naldo looked at her. He did not say yes or no. He turned his horse east. She followed. The 2-mile detour became 4 when they found that the eastern route ran through a dry wash that had flooded recently and left a mud floor that would hold tracks for a week. They went north through the scrub instead, off any trail, in terrain that made Penny's repaired shoe work for every step, and Martha kept her eyes moving in the pattern she had developed over 63 days. Ahead, left, right, back. A slow, continuous rotation that she could sustain for hours now without tiring. She thought about Thomas. She was doing that more, allowing it more. In the first weeks, it had been too large, too raw, too much like touching a burn. Now it was more like she searched for the right word and could not find one in English and wondered if there was one in some other language for the thing grief became when you had been carrying it long enough that it stopped being agony and started being just weight. Familiar weight. Hers. She thought about the last morning. She had made coffee. She had put it on the table. Thomas had been in the study going through papers, and she had called to him twice, and he had said he was coming, and she had drunk her coffee alone at the table and been mildly annoyed, the specific mild annoyance of a long marriage, the kind of annoyance that is also completely comfortable, that has none of the sharp edges of real anger, that is just the texture of 2 lives fitted together and occasionally catching. He had come out eventually, looking distracted, with a paper in his hand. He had said, "I need to tell you something." She had said, "Sit down and drink your coffee first." He had sat down. He had never told her the something. His heart, or what Gerald Fitch had arranged to look like his heart, had made sure of that. She understood now, with the particular clarity that danger gave to thought, that the something he had needed to tell her was the ledgers. He had been going to tell her. He had been pulling the thread quietly and carefully, and he had been about to bring her in, and she had told him to sit down and drink his coffee first. That thought she put in the box very hard and very deep. It would keep. There would be time for that thought on the other side of this, if there was an other side, and she intended there to be. They made camp that second night in a hollow between 2 large rock formations that blocked the wind from 3 sides and made the 4th side their watch direction. Naldo built a fire low and small and blocked it further with his bedroll spread as a reflector so that the light went up and not out. Martha ate and thought and went through Cecilia's map again with the fire's small light. According to the map, they were perhaps 40 miles from Prescott. 2 more days of the pace they were making. 3 if the terrain stayed difficult. She thought about Howard Daniels, about what she was going to say to him. She had rehearsed it. She had rehearsed it 200 times in the last 63 days, in the way you rehearse things when you have nothing but time and movement and the inside of your own head to inhabit. She had a version that was formal, that was document forward, that led with the ledgers and the letter and Thomas's initial contact with Daniels. She had a version that was emotional, that led with Thomas's face and the cup of coffee and the something he never got to say. She was going to use the formal version. She knew she was going to use the emotional version. She also thought about what came after. She had not allowed herself to think about after very much, because after required assuming she would reach it, and that assumption was a luxury she had not been able to afford. But tonight, in the hollow, in the low firelight with 40 miles to go, and Prescott as an actual close and reachable thing instead of an abstraction, tonight she let herself. After mint, the ledgers delivered. The evidence processed. Gerald Fitch indicted, or whatever the appropriate legal term was. She was not a lawyer, but the point was named, made to account for himself. After Mint, going back to the house in Tucson. Or not going back. She hadn't decided. The house had Thomas in every room of it, and she did not know yet if that was a reason to return or a reason to never go back. And that was the kind of question that she understood would not answer itself until she was standing at the door. After Mint, being a widow again. Properly. Without the running and the danger and the clear, clean purpose of getting somewhere. Just a woman who had lost her husband and whose husband had been taken from her, and all the shapeless, directionless grief that went with that. She wasn't sure she was ready for after. She told herself she would deal with that when she got there. She slept. The third day brought weather. Not a storm. The December desert didn't do full storms often, but a cold front moving down from the north that dropped the temperature 20 degrees before noon and brought a wind that cut sideways across the terrain and made every piece of exposed skin feel like an argument. Martha pulled Thomas's coat tight and kept moving. The coat was too large for her, had always been too large, was made for Thomas's particular kind of solidity, which had been the kind of solidity that was not size exactly, but the impression of size, the quality of being difficult to move. The wind moved her anyway. It moved everything. It took the scrub and pulled it flat and howled through the rock formations with a sound like something announcing itself. Naldo did not seem particularly bothered by the wind. He rode into it with the same ease he rode into everything, as though weather was information rather than inconvenience, as though the appropriate response to the world's behavior was to read it rather than argue with it. Martha tried to ride like that. She was not good at it yet. At midday, they stopped in a shallow ravine to water the horses from a pool that the cold had not quite frozen over, and while the horses drank, Naldo looked at the sky in a way he looked at things when he was reading them, and said, "There's a town 2 miles west. Small. Has a blacksmith." "We should avoid towns," Martha said. "We should also eat." She looked at him. He looked back, with that particular quality of patience that was not passivity, but was simply the absence of urgency on points that did not require urgency. She thought about the food situation. Cecilia's 4 days of provisions were entering day 3. They had food for tonight, and maybe tomorrow morning if they were careful. Prescott was still the better part of 2 days out. She thought about the men behind her, about the tracks yesterday, about Gerald Fitch's particular calculus of pressure, which she had been studying for 63 days the way you study a thing that is trying to kill you. "How small is small?" she said. 60 people. Maybe less. 60 people. Small enough that strangers were noticed. Small enough that 2 strangers were a conversation. But also small enough that there was no reason for Gerald Fitch's men to be stationed there, because men who were looking for someone moving north would position themselves on the roads, not in tiny towns 2 miles off any route. 1 hour, she said. In and out. He nodded and turned the horses west. The town was called Secco, and it was even smaller than 60 people when you arrived in person. It was the kind of town that had happened to a location rather than being planned. A blacksmith shop, a dry goods store, a house with a hand-lettered sign advertising meals, for other structures in various states of being maintained and not. A single street of packed dirt that the wind was currently doing its best to redistribute. There were 2 horses outside the dry goods store. They were not horses she recognized. She pulled Penny up short. Naldo looked at her. She looked at the horses. She was doing the math. 2 horses, unknown, no particular reason to suspect, every reason to be careful. The difference between careful and paranoid being a distinction she had maintained with some difficulty for 63 days. "I'll go in," Naldo said. "You stay with the horses." She started to disagree. He had already swung down and handed her his reins. She held the reins. She sat on Penny in the wind on the single street of the town of Secco, Arizona, and she watched the door of the dry goods store, and she kept her breathing steady because her breathing was one of the things she had learned to manage in the last 2 months, learned that it was the body's emotional telegraph, that if she controlled it, she controlled everything downstream of it. He was inside for 6 minutes, the longest 6 minutes since the night she'd found the ledgers. He came out with a cloth bag, and he came out alone, and he walked back to the horses at the same easy pace. He did everything, and put his foot in the stirrup, and mounted, and said nothing. 2 ranchers from south of town. She let her breath go. "Also," he said, and held up the cloth bag, bread, dried beef, and something the woman inside called apple preserve that I suspect are more apple than the ones yesterday were cactus. She almost laughed. Almost. It surprised her, the almost, that the machinery for laughing still existed, still could be activated by something as small as a man holding a bag of apple preserves. Thomas would have laughed. Thomas would have laughed all the way out of the town. "Let's go," she said. They went. The fourth day was the one. She knew it was the fourth day because she had been counting, and she knew it was the one because of the way the morning felt, thinner, brighter, the air carrying something different, the particular altitude change that came with approaching Prescott, which sat higher than the desert floor, which announced itself in the quality of the coal before you could see it. They came over a ridge in mid-morning, and there it was. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the town and the basin below them, smoke from chimneys, roads running in actual cardinal directions, buildings with right angles and glass windows, the particular visual grammar of a place where people had decided to stay. She stopped Penny and looked at it. 66 days she had been moving toward something, and now the something was there, sitting below her in the winter morning sun, small and real and not at all equal to its significance. She was aware of Naldo, stopped beside her. She was aware of the wind, which had eased since yesterday, and the cold, which had not, and the bag on her back with Thomas's ledgers and Thomas's letter and Thomas's photograph. She did not say anything for a long time. The address on the back of the map. Naldo said, eventually, "Do you know which part of town?" "North End," she said. "Near the courthouse." He nodded. She looked at him. She thought about everything she wanted to say about what he had done, about the canyon, and the fire, and the 4 days, and the tracks he had seen that she had not, about the way he had stopped on a road where people didn't stop. She thought about his sister in Flagstaff, and the nephew born in October, and the days he had spent not getting there. She did not have the right words. She was not sure the right words existed. "Your sister child," she said. "Does he have a name?" Something shifted in his face very slightly. "Raphael." "That's a good name," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at Prescott again. She looked back at him. "Go to Flagstaff," she said. "You've given me more than enough. I can find the address from here." He looked at her for a long moment with that careful, unhurried look. "The address is north of the courthouse," he said. "I know where it is. I've been to Prescott." A pause. "I'll see you there." She understood she was not going to win this argument. She understood, too, that she did not want to win it, that the not winning was in fact exactly what she needed, and that the kindness of a person who understood that distinction was a particular and rare thing. She turned Penny toward the road that went down into the basin. 66 days from Tucson. 2 states of anxiety, the running kind and the arriving kind, and she was learning the arriving kind now, which was its own creature which had its own demands. The running kind had kept her sharp and present and afraid. The arriving kind asked different questions. Questions about what came next. Questions about what she was walking into. Questions about Howard Daniels and whether he was what Thomas's letter suggested. He was a man of conscience inside a system that made conscience expensive. She was about to find out. She rode down into Prescott with the bag on her back and Thomas's coat around her and 66 days behind her, and everything that mattered in her hands. The courthouse was visible from the edge of town. Its flag was moving in the wind. She rode toward it.